Ladies, gentlemen, this is the European History Lecture for Tuesday, the 3rd of May, 2022. I have no work to return to you. We have a lot to do today, but there was an interesting story in the news last night. Against all precedent and betraying all trusts, somebody within the Supreme Court organization chose to make a very political leak to the press, notes open, about an upcoming Supreme Court decision that could invalidate Roe v. Wade, which is the Supreme Court decision that led to the nationalization of abortion rights in this country. Such a decision is about the most important and nuanced thing that the Supreme Court could do. So, of course, somebody leaked it for political reasons. Whoever did it deserves to be disbarred and to never practice law again because they violated solemn oaths to preserve the integrity of the court. And what might have been a measured, careful explanation of how Roe v. Wade is not a very well constitutionally grounded decision has been turned into a political fiasco, which seems to serve the purpose of trying to gin up everyone in order to ignore the economy, ignore the foreign policy disasters of this administration, and try to give the Democrats a fighting chance this coming November by making the argument that if you don't vote Democrat, you're voting to send women back to back alley abortions, which is a grotesque and nasty argument. I don't want to get too deep into this, but it is the news. And if you have a thought or a comment, you will take a few minutes to entertain them, and I'll offer what little clarity I can, if you're interested. Yes.
So can you explain what exactly they did? Because I do have something to say on it, but I need to know.
My understanding, first of all, this is a decision that's not yet ready for publication. It was leaked. The Chief Justice Roberts confirmed that it was valid, and therefore is probably going to be the basis of the decision. The system in this country is supposed to be that the lawmakers make laws. That is the U.S. Congress or state legislatures. In the case of abortion, that didn't happen. In 1973, a Supreme Court case, Roe v. Wade, was used by an activist Supreme Court to create a right to privacy that allows abortion to be illegal. And with that Supreme Court decision, the legislative approach was bypassed, and since 1973, 50 years basically, abortion on demand has been the law of the land. Now, we're of only, I think, about a dozen countries that allows abortion after the first trimester. Most countries that permit abortion, like the ones in Western Europe, do not permit it after a certain point because the fetus has developed human qualities. Since 73, the Supreme Court, which is supposed to be relatively apolitical, above the fray, to check constitutional matters, has been brought front and center into American politics because the way that abortion was decided was through a Supreme Court decision, not through the legislative process. If a decision is made to invalidate Roe v. Wade and related decisions, what will be done is either the states will each make law, and I suspect that even Republican states will permit abortion up to a certain point and under certain circumstances. And you'll have different states with different laws, and people will vote with their feet. But the National Democratic Party has also decided to use this as an opportunity to try to argue for national abortion law. And in order to do so, they're threatening once again to pack the Supreme Court, which is para-constitutional at best, and to invalidate the filibuster rules of the Senate, which prevent the tyranny of the majority. So basically, this is a central issue, as I understand it. I'm trying to be fair to members of the Democratic coalition, to have abortion on demand everywhere in all the land. They make an equation between abortion rights and slavery. And they would argue that just as you can't allow slavery in Alabama, but not Idaho, you can't allow Alabama to have a law that would restrict abortion beyond a certain point, but not allow that in Idaho. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Now you have something to say.
I think that we definitely should be like Western Europe in this sense. I don't think it should be outlawed like a lot of extreme conservatives view, because there are certain instances such as rape, and then also other things
Rape
like
and incest are usually
rape, incest, and then also if you know that you're gonna have genetic complications, like, and your life is at risk, but this happens, that needs to be allowed. And I mean, one of the things that I know, I think it was Texas that made it so you can get an abortion until or after like X amount of weeks, and it was within the first trimester. Not everyone's gonna know that, because certain women have different like cycles, so you don't always have the same instances there. But I don't think it should be allowed because after the first trimester, because of human qualities. But also, it's just such a touchy subject that people get so angry about these days, and it should just only be focused on the health of the individual and the child rather than the political meaning behind it, which it's an individual choice, and in America you have the right to make individual choices so long as they don't harm another human being.
And you can see, obviously, where this would be seen as harm to another human being by
Right.
certain interpretation.
Right, because some people think that, oh, once you're pregnant, it's a child, but scientifically that's not the case, and that gets ignored quite a bit.
That's a philosophical question, but you're right. You are right, and your position seems reasonable and well expressed. Do you have anything more to say?
Not definitely.
Okay. Sam, you were next, then Portia.
So I think with this whole event, it's not the whole argument about abortion is not like what's important about this event, because the reality is that it's people have their base their opinions off of fundamental beliefs that you can't change. You can't convince anybody. So I mean, arguing about it isn't really.
Which is why we almost never argue about it in this class.
Right. I think that the more important thing is the implications of this kind of political move, like. And I'm not sure how organized this was or how thought out this was, but getting this information to be leaked from the Supreme Court, that's kind of a big deal. And I mean, it's remarkable how many events just like this have happened over the past like 6-7 years that have led to, that have manipulated the minds of the people in a way that kind of shies away from what's important.
The American system requires the basic trust of the people that win or lose, we play by constitutional rules. And I believe that in recent decades that trust has been eroded by several attempts to grab power. But that is a belief.
And I mean, it shouldn't. Nothing like this should be clandestine. I mean, political parties should be very transparent. And it's scary to me. I mean, for instance, like look at the whole Oscar slap thing. Now, in my opinion, that was a political ploy to take attention away from the Ukraine war, and I think that's if people can get away with that, they're going to keep doing it, and that's a problem.
Indeed. Politics, citizens are expected to think rather than feel as they vote, or to think in addition to feeling.
I was going to ask about this whole situation and everything that got leaked. Was it made clear up to what day or what trimester they would say abortion for everyone everywhere, or was that?
They may have. It's 100-page plus rough draft decision.
Oh, okay.
So I haven't read it, and even the commentators that I was listening to hadn't read the entire thing. They got the gist. And because it was just again, how would you feel if a paper that you had worked on forever on a very important topic was leaked in rough draft form? At the very least, you should have some understanding of how this is for the Supreme Court. And this is the This is the hot button issue in the culture war between left and right. Where does life begin? What protections should life have? Whose life are we talking? The life of the mother or the life of the child? Both not, neither.
It is so unfortunate this is happening. It has just been back to back to back to back things that are just occurring in our world. I guess similarly to what Sam was saying, the timing is so. I don't like chalking it up to political play.
I don't know.
Like this many coincidences, it's gotten wild.
The question, above and beyond the question of life, which is an interesting thing to set aside, do we have good sportsmanship? Oddly enough, that simple British thing, good sportsmanship, is a prime requisite for any free people. If free people have good sportsmanship, win or lose, it doesn't matter, because you're not going to be definitively destroyed by your opponents. You win some elections, you move your agenda forward a little bit. You lose some elections, they move their agenda forward, your agenda goes back. Then you win some elections. If the rules of the Constitution, which that flag represents, are considered sacred by both sides, then we have in common as American citizens more than anything that will divide us. The one time we didn't was slavery, states' rights, and the U.S. and the Civil War. And this is what can happen to a country. And of course, the timing is suspect. Absolutely, as the timing of several other things are. I hope and believe that the American people will be wise and have common sense. Whatever their beliefs on a particular issue, I hope that we will appreciate that freedom requires us to behave in a certain fashion. And if it is just win at all costs, we lose our freedom. We lose our rights. And we either become part of the ruling party or their victim. And that is what I want to avoid. I can live under Democrats. I don't want to live under communists. I don't want to live under fascists or National Socialists. I can live under Democrats. I can live under moderate Republicans. I can live under conservative Republicans. And so can you. I can live under libertarians. But once you get beyond the constitutional limits of government power, that's where it gets dicey. And there isn't a more incandescent issue than when does life begin.
Okay, two quick things. So, first in regards to what Sam was saying about the slap thing, about being a political ploy, like, all you need to pull something like that off is two brilliant actors. And that's who the people were involved in that thing. Another thing was about the California abortion, like 2 weeks after birth, they're allowing abortion.
Yeah, that's insane, and I think most people will reject it because that's murder.
Right, and the thing,
It's self-evidently murder. No, when the baby is out of the womb, they're talking 2 weeks after pregnancy.
right.
No, that's obviously murder, and most people who are not complete fanatics on the abortion issue would recognize that.
Right, and I think it's hard because, like, well, now they're being consistent because they couldn't determine where life began. So, like, why does life begin on that side then?
Trust me, Haley, there are people on the other side that have just as deep a conviction as you have about life.
Right.
The one thing that's wise in a case like this is to respect the integrity of both sides and the goodwill of both sides. Even if what they're thinking seems completely upside down evil, accept the possibility that they're well motivated and they simply see the world differently. If you do that, you play the game that Americans are supposed to play with one another, which is fair play. If you start thinking of your enemy as a genocidal menace to mankind, then you stop holding back, and they'll stop holding back, and we're at civil war. Yes, be real quick, because you had already said things.
So I just had a thought about the thing in California, abortion. They should just consider abortion, like if, for instance, if a mother who was carrying a baby were to be murdered, would they count the baby as another?
Sometimes they do.
Exactly. So just take that span of time that would be counted, and that's when abortion should be allowed, right?
Yeah.
And then the other thing, You said, and this was in one of your newspaper articles, I think.
I don't like to bring those into the class. So let's leave that. Okay, thank you, please. And there are reasons why I don't. Not the least of which is that's for me as a citizen, not as a teacher. Yes.
Okay, so I know back in 2021, Idaho adopted Texas's ban on abortion, with exceptions to rape and incest, as well as they outlawed abortion after 6 weeks. So, is it the same type of thing with? Is it an absolute ban, or are there still?
No. What it is, okay. What limited understanding I have, bear in mind it is a very limited understanding, is that the 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 underpinning of national abortion on demand is the Roe versus Wade Supreme Court decision. If they invalidate that, it automatically goes to the legislatures of the states, and if certain people have their way, to the federal government. And at that point, the lawmakers will make their decisions. No, it is not a particular return to any particular law. It is simply the invalidation of Roe v. Wade.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you for the civil conversation. Oh, yes.
Oh,
No, please. No, I really want to hear it.
I mean, aren't the best abortion arguments the ones that go into the different direction and say that the baby is in fact alive, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then no, and this is where it is. I have a belief. It's a personal belief. My belief is life begins at conception. Sperm meets egg. They fertilize. That's a potential human life. Now it can die in any number of ways, both within and outside the womb naturally. But there are people who say that a fetus is not a human being until a certain point. Now, globally, if the law is any indication, most societies tend to think that after the first trimester, after the first 3 months, and that's not 6 weeks, that's 12 weeks, it should the fetus should be considered a human being possessed of certain rights. But there are people who argue that until the baby leaves mom, it is a matter for the mother and the mother and the mother only. That the baby is a subset of mom, and that if mom wants to abort it, she can. And she shouldn't have to explain it to anyone. That's me trying to explain the pro-choice argument, the rather extreme pro-choice argument, which says that the rights of the mother absolutely trump the rights of whatever is inside of her until it leaves her body. What's shocking about the California laws, it seems to fudge that standard. I don't know how they do that. I have not studied the California law, but my blood pressure can only go so high. Am I missing your point, or did you not?
No, it's just, have you ever heard of the violinist? Okay, so, a while back, I was, looking at this, one analogy that a pro-choicer made. And it essentially was, you basically wake up in a hospital bed. And when you look, you realize that you're tied with another person, about a 30-year-old. And what happens is the doctor comes in and they say, I'm sorry, but you have been kidnapped by the Society of Music Lovers. And so what had happened was there you knew this very famous violinist, and they didn't, and he had this condition and he was going to die. However, so, and they didn't want that to happen. So they went and they tried to find a person who could, fix them. And you were that person with that specific DNA and that specific, body type. And, now you're tied to this person. But the doctor says, don't worry, you will only be like this for 9 months. And, that's the analogy.
Interesting. But the analogy falls down here, and I've got to say this regardless of which side it helps, just logically.
Yeah.
A mother is not merely committed to, say, carry the child during the time of pregnancy.
Yeah.
Most mothers are not willing to adopt immediately after birth. Some are. But if you are not, then it's not just the pregnancy, it's the rest of your life. Because you're nursing the child for several years, you're carrying, your life changes. I'm not a parent, so I don't know precisely how life changes. I'm thoughtful and educated, I try to imagine, but I don't know firsthand. All of your parents do. In any event, are there any other? Are you finished?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Are there any other thoughts on this? Okay. Yes. No. Thinking about it? I would love you to say something if you feel like it, but I'm not going to force you.
I do think that it's like very not. It's not great to like have your essay much like your life's work sort of eat. But at the same time, I feel like the laws should definitely be like obviously not like the whole pregnancy, but ultimately it's like it's none of their business what of like the mother's life decisions, and sometimes like under certain circumstances like it can't be helped. So I feel like they shouldn't put too many limitations on it. Then it's just sort of like the line like this is how free you can be with your.
And that is a eloquent defense of the life of the mother being the primary thing to be considered.
Right.
Thank you. Now we move on to something totally different. World War II is the most preventable war in human history. I'll say that again. It could have been stopped so many times by so many people. And yet, like a freight train trundling on towards you when you're tied to the railroad tracks, like in an old silent movie, it just keeps coming and coming and coming until splat, there it is. Splat. Yes, that's a good analogy for open war. So this is assessing the era of appeasement that begins in the late 20s and goes through the 30s up to the beginning of the Second World War, which is inviting the most preventable war in human history, a war that almost nobody wanted. So, we begin, and I'm going to do this quickly because I've already made reference to it. Occidentus Invertebratus. Occidentus Invertebratus is my lousy Latin for the West without a backbone. Before World War I, Western nations were trying to civilize the rest of the world. Agree or disagree with their imperialism, they had good intentions. But after the First World War, the West, especially Western Europe, is morally exhausted, physically exhausted, spiritually exhausted in terms of population, smaller and weaker than they've been in a while. So, Britain is fatigued, and Britain's finances have been upended by the war, and they really never recovered. Not until the 21st century. France is exhausted and divided. The war happens mostly on French territory, in the West anyway, and the French really do lose a couple of generations of young men. More men as a proportion of their population, certainly, than the British. More than the Germans. And the French, after World War I, returned to a hyper-divided political system, where there are communists and socialists and monarchists and ultra-church-oriented people and a bunch of liberal Democrats in the middle. And the French left hates the French right, and the French right hates the French left. And this is going to be a recipe for the French left having more loyalty to Moscow than it does to Paris. And the French right is going to ultimately collaborate with Hitler, at least much of it will, in order to crush the French left. This is nasty. This is worse than our politics right now in the United States. And that's saying something. The French really have a poisoned political system, and when both sides are so poisoned against one another, it's very difficult to maintain a republic. And ultimately, their republic collapses under the stresses of war. Meanwhile, the United States, thanks to, among other things, Wilson's choice not to bring a single Republican with him to Versailles, means that the United States turns its back on the rest of the world, except financially. Financially, we'll engage our businessmen, our bankers, and so forth. But The American Congress rejects the Treaty of Versailles. We reject the League of Nations. We are not going to be part of any collective security arrangement. And the United States, except for arms limitation and foreign aid, is going to basically let the rest of the world go to hell while it pays attention to itself. And without Britain, France, and the United States, there is no West. Now, there is a widespread fear of communism. This fear of communism comes about, first of all, theoretically. People don't like being told they're the enemies of mankind, they're bourgeois, and we're going to have a revolution and completely destroy you. But on top of that, the actions of the Bolsheviki in the Russian Civil War indicate a ruthless totalitarian police state. And all civil wars are very nasty. The whites did things against the reds as well, but the reds win. And they win through an absolutely brutal communitarianism that will abide no dissent. The Comintern is absolute evidence of the attempt by worldwide communists to establish a global revolution. The Communist International, organized in Moscow, is where every communist party in the world is invited to come and participate. And it's where, frankly, every communist party in the world receives its orders from the Russian Communist Party, or the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, as it's called later. So American communists and French communists, Italian communists, and even British communists, to the extent they exist, end up being tools of Moscow and of Russian policy as much as they are genuine revolutionaries for a global communist order. Because there's only one communist country between the wars, and that is in Soviet Russia. In Germany, there's an attempt to have a communist revolution of the Spartacists, but they're put down by the Freikorps, a group of German veterans. And in 1919, Hungary goes Soviet. Under Bela Kun, for several months, there is a socialist or communist government in Hungary. But this is where Herbert Hoover shows a different kind of international power. Hoover will later become president of the United States as the head of an international relief agency providing food and medical assistance to everyone in Europe after the war. And this is considered a humanitarian thing. But Hoover suspends all shipments to Hungary so long as Bela Kun's communist government is in power. So the Hungarian people are not getting what everyone around them is getting, which is food shipments, medical supplies, and all of the various help that people can need after the horrors of World War I. Once Bela Kun's government is overthrown, then the aid flows. So this is an example of a particularly American approach to international power, which is the use of economics, sanctions, and things like it. And we've seen this used since, including today, as regards the international situation of Eastern Europe. So there's a lot of fear of communism, and there's a lot of good reasons for that fear. It's not nothing. Also, the West is consumed by the ideology of pacific utopianism. They're pacifists, and they want a better world. And, this is very idealistic. Certainly, even I, dyed-in-the-wool conservative, can understand why someone would want a world that is peaceful and prosperous and working towards a more perfect order. I get that. I get why people would want that. I don't believe in it, but I get why people would, and who believe in it are really dedicated to it. One earnest of this is from the Versailles Treaty, the idea of national self-determination causing the Balkanization of Central and Eastern Europe into a bunch of relatively ineffective microstates. And the utopianism of Wilson basically dooms the center and eastern half of Europe to political instability because the countries really do not have the wherewithal to be prosperous long term, nor do they have the wherewithal to stand up to Germany and Russia when both of them become resurgent. The League of Nations is an example of pacific idealism, utopianism, the belief that collective security will protect the world from war. What is collective security? Well, let's imagine for a moment a theoretical League of Nations where the United States is involved. And you have an event like the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, which is northeastern China. What should happen in a case of collective security is Japan should be in no doubt that if they invade Manchuria, that the rest of the world will intervene militarily on the side of the Manchurian Chinese. Therefore, the calculation of an aggressor would have to take into consideration that unless the League of Nations is particularly impressed by your reasons for invading, the League of Nations is actually going to engage in combat operations against you. And that won't be a good thing, fighting the entire world. But with the United States not involved, and with the fatigue of the Western European powers, collective security becomes a bit of a joke. The French make alliances with various countries in Eastern Europe, like Poland and Czechoslovakia. The British have alliances with the French. But it's not got the same kind of deterrence that if you attack, the rest of the world will inevitably come into fighting against you. It's not as crystal clear as that. Make sure. Oh, you do have your notes there. Good. I forget which science fiction writer. It may have been Frank Herbert, or it may have been Heinlein, or it may have been Isaac Asimov. But somebody proposed that the solution to the nuclear age would be if anyone post-1945 used any kind of nuclear weapon, that the other nuclear powers all would flatten their capital. In other words, if the United States were to deploy nuclear weapons somewhere in the world, that the British, the French, the Russians, the Chinese, the Indians, the North Koreans, probably the Iranians, the Israelis, the Japanese, and everyone else who has nuclear weapons would nuke Washington, each with their own thing. And this is supposed to create a deterrence, a warning. Don't use nuclear weapons, or the rest of us are treaty-bound and honor-bound to nuke you. And your ruling class is going to be wiped out. We don't have that. We don't have anything like that. And the League of Nations didn't have anything like that because collective security did not have the strongest country in the world as part of it. Yes?
I think it was Frank Herbert in the Dune series. That's basically the policy.
Yes, yeah, that's where I got it. That's exactly where I got it. I just wasn't positive. Thank you for helping me recall. Now, it's not just the League of Nations. The Geneva Convention on the treatment of prisoners of war is signed in the 1920s. Not by the Japanese. But it's signed by most everyone else. And what it says is that a prisoner of war is entitled to the same diet as a civilian in the country that is housing them. That a prisoner of war must reveal their name, their rank, their serial number. And that's it. They don't have to reveal anything else, and you are forbidden from torturing them. Now, in World War II, certain basic aspects of the Geneva Convention on prisoners are observed by the Western powers and by the Germans as regards the Western powers' prisoners. Not the French, because the French surrendered. But British and American prisoners are treated, and Canadian prisoners are treated much better than anyone else in German custody. And this is in part because the Germans have lots of prisoners in Britain and Canada and the United States. We actually ship German prisoners over the Atlantic, work on farms in central Canada or in the Great Plains of the United States. But the way the Germans treat the Russians, the Poles, anyone else, is what you would expect from a country that produces death camps. It's really nasty stuff. And as to torture, they'll torture the heck out of you until you tell them everything they want or until you break. Now, even Western prisoners are tortured by the Germans to a degree on their way to camp. And we do the same thing. Now, we rough them up. They rough us up. But the whole idea of the Geneva Convention is that once you're a prisoner, you're a non-combatant again. and you are not a valid target of war. You can receive care packages. The Red Cross can send you packages to keep you to keep your spirits up and to keep your nutrition up. And the Swiss Red Cross, which was neutral in World War II, could inspect and did inspect prisoner of war camps in Germany and in Britain and in the United States. This is an idealistic thing. The idea that you are not allowed to abuse the prisoners that you take. And given that in ancient times, prisoners of war were the source of most slaves, that's a pretty big deal. The Japanese, of course, absolutely never subscribed to this, and the things they did to us, to our prisoners, to prisoners of the Dutch and the British and anyone else they got a hold of, and the Chinese, is as bad almost as anything that the Nazis did. Actually, in some ways, it's worse. But this idea that prisoners should be treated well, this idea of international law, is an idealistic, pacific thing. Another thing, before World War I, a world court is set up at The Hague in Holland, in the Netherlands. And this world court arrogates unto itself the ability to adjudicate matters of international law. Did anyone in the United States vote for the establishment of a world court at The Hague? No. Did anyone in Britain? No. Did anyone in France? No. Did anyone in the Netherlands? No. This is a self-appointed group of jurists who want to establish the principle of international law. And one of the things that the Treaty of Versailles does, because of Wilson, is it gives credence to the international, or to the World Court at The Hague, to the point where the World Court has sentenced people to punishments because they're war criminals. They're criminals against human rights. And on certain occasions, they've actually been taken into custody and imprisoned. So over the last 100 years, actually 120 years, this idea of an international legal order with international law that all countries are subject to has grown. But I'm telling you, it's a cat leash. A cat leash is when you dangle a string in front of your cat or kitten, and it goes hum, and it holds onto the string as long as it wants to. That's a cat leash. You can bring it to the kitchen, you can bring it to the living room. But when the cat gets bored and goes and leaves the leash alone, it doesn't work. International law works if your country and the countries that you're dealing with both accept it. But in dealing with the People's Republic of China, for example, they don't accept international law as being binding upon them, nor does Putin's Russia, nor do others. The idea of international law is an earnest, an example of Pacific utopianism. The idea that the nations of the world will be bridled by good laws. The truth is, from the perspective of a Westerner who believes in republic, such a court would have to be constituted on the basis of free elections, and such a court would have to be constituted on the basis of a written constitution that we would then sign off on. Without those two things happening, international law is hit or miss. Does everyone involved in a particular crisis want to acknowledge and use international law? Then it'll work. Do the players not want to? Then it's irrelevant. The exception to American isolationism, I already told you, was the Washington Naval Conference, which limited the number of battleships and dreadnought battlecruisers and a bunch of other things that were naval, and prevented a naval arms race. Washington-style naval agreements limited the growth of navies from basically 1921 through about 1936. And it was after 36 the German rearmament was so big that other countries began to rearm too. But still, that's a 15-year moratorium on building hugely expensive battleships and battle cruisers. Now we come to the ultimate in Pacific utopianism, the Kellogg-Briand Peace Pact. Kellogg is an American State Department official. Aristide Briand is a French diplomatic official. And Kellogg and Briand come together and get the nations of the world, including the United States, to agree to outlaw war forever. No more war. Decided in 1929, I believe. So, in 1929, the League of Nations, plus the United States and others, signed an agreement, an international treaty outlawing war. Problem solved. Mischief managed. It's all over now. No more war. See? It's in the treaty. It's... you get the idea. This is real. Now, there are two great books of pacifism between the wars. One of which I'll deal with B first is All Quiet on the Western Front. All Quiet on the Western Front is not just a travelogue of Paul Baumer as he leaves home and goes to fight in the trenches. It's not just, yay, there we were fighting this day, this happened, we ate rats, we attacked them, it was cool. No, the entire point of All Quiet on the Western Front is to tell you how war is absolutely, without redeeming qualities, evil. That war takes lives that are full of promise, and it cripples or ends them prematurely, and even those who survive carry psychological wounds. Had Paul Baumer not been shot by a sniper in 1918, just before the end of the war, while sketching a bluebird, spoiler alert, what kind of man would he have been? Would he have been able to fit into polite society again? Would he have been able to live in peace again? Would he have joined the Nazi Party? We don't know. Because he's killed. But All Quiet is definitely a book with a message. And the message is, war, good God, y'all, what is it good for? Absolutely nothing. Say it again. That's from the 60s song, Anti-Vietnam War, but it's the same idea. There's nothing good about war in that book. The other book is The Merchants of Death. And the thesis of The Merchants of Death is that World War I was established by bankers and by arms manufacturers in order to make money. You sell a lot of bullets when there's a war on. And so the stupid, dumb people who are patriotic and wave their flags go into a meat grinder to make millionaires richer. That's the thesis. And what you are supposed to get from it is only a moron believes that fighting for your country is just. Because you're a sucker. You're a sucker. You're being used to sell bullets. You're being used to sell uniforms. You're being used by what today would be called the military-industrial complex. The entire point of war is to make money for evil capitalists. So, with those two books, the encouragement for young men to take up arms in protection of their society is really, really not there. It's quite the contrary. So this leads to, in the West, a system of appeasement. Appeasement, as a systematic policy, is when you give the aggressor what he wants in hopes that he'll go away. So the schoolyard bully comes up, grabs you by the scruff of the neck, smacks you against a wall, holds their fist up and says, "Give me your money." And you give them their money. And you hope they go away. And usually they'll toss you on the ground and say, "Yeah, right, you gave me." Of course, if you give them your money, there's no guarantee they're not going to then go pam, pow, boom, boom, and beat the hell out of you anyway. You've just given them your money. You haven't done anything to stop them. And they'll be back. There's no question they will be back. The idea of appeasement is peace at any cost. We're going to give the aggressor nations what they want because better for them to have little victories here and there won through diplomacy than for us to have the trenches again. In fact, it's worse than the trenches. Science fiction story. Olaf Stapledon. Last and First Men. Posits a Second World War that H.G. Wells would recognize, that a lot of others describe. War is declared. Great fleets of bombing aircraft take off from Germany and from England. They pass each other crossing the Dutch coast. They even salute one another. When they arrive over their targets, they drop mustard gas. Mustard gas, mustard gas, mustard gas on every urban center. They go back, but everyone's dead. The belief was in the 1930s that another world war would be a very short one, that aircraft would destroy human society from the air with, not with high explosives, but with mustard gas. The truth is, had that happened, human society would have been destroyed, no more civilization. There might be barbarians left in the countryside, but the civilization, the city-based societies of the West and of the East, they'd be gone. And in fact, in Stapleton's story, it's just the beginning, the eclipse of European civilization. The fear of a genuine Armageddon then is equivalent to our fear of nuclear war today. And our fear of nuclear war is even more well-grounded. The idea that if a war reaches a certain tripwire, and if that tripwire is crossed, doomsday is unleashed, is something that humanity has lived in terror of since the First World War. Most people assume that happens when the mushroom clouds obliterate Hiroshima and Nagasaki. No. In the 1920s and 30s, thinkers really worried about another world war where gas would end human civilization. So what the appeasers say is better for us to give the bully what he wants, better to pay the Danish Viking the Dane guild. Because the alternative is, at best, one more set of trench warfare. Who knows how long that'll go on. At worst, the gassing of every infant, of every pet, of every child, of every woman, of every man, of every grandma and grandpa. All gone with this airborne acid. So next time we will talk about the course of appeasement, which is something that is going to directly lead to the Second World War. Any questions, comments, or thoughts? Thank you for your attention, and you can talk among yourselves.